16, XYZ. Okay, we're good. So, all right, we're going to get ourselves started over here before the alarm starts. The sheets of paper that we handed out on the sheets, this is all the questions that we're going to be talking about as we go through aging a bottle. But most importantly, if you look at the screen up here, it's a Society for Historical Archaeology. Think of the first three letters, SHA. If anything that we talk about brings up a question, or if you want to learn more about it, if you put SHA bottles in your Google search, it'll take you right to their site. It's an intense, full collection. What I find beneficial is when you go there, don't go so much to try to study and read everything. The best thing is just go through it, go through the pictures, and get yourself sort of comfortable with some of the terms.
So to begin, who here today is new to the hobby of antique bottle detecting?
All right, we don't have any newbies.
Well, who's been collecting maybe for a few years?
I have.
Or perhaps maybe 20 to 30 years, a little longer.
Actually, I just went on it by accident. I'm a clock collector. And people had bottles, and I liked them, and I bought them.
So it's one of those tangents off of your other hobby, which happened to me as well. Well, in tonight's lecture, we're going to offer something for everyone, but mostly we hope that those who are new to the hobby will leave never looking at a piece of antique glass the same way. We hope you will learn how to ask questions that tease out the history behind these antique bottles, understanding how and when they were made.
And teasing out, these are the questions that we want you to ask, so that when you go to an antique store, or if somebody has an old bottle in your house, you can start asking certain questions that will lead you to a definite answer about how that bottle was manufactured. So we're going to hope that this understanding will become the basis for how you should value antique glass bottles, not in terms of dollars and cents, but really just in terms of its history. I always get disappointed when I watch the Antique Roadshow and somebody has a beautiful painting and they say, you know, I really don't like it, but it's been sitting upstairs, and then they say, well, it's worth $250,000. Oh, suddenly I love it. Loving a piece of artwork should not be related to the value of it in terms of dollars and cents, but what's its history? Who was the artist? What inspired the artist to do that? So that's what we're going to sort of get into here.
And before we begin our show, we talked about reviewing some basic terms that will help you to identify glass. And these are all terms that we're going to reference the names throughout tonight's lecture. Starting towards the bottom, quite logically, we have the base of your bottle. This curved portion going from the base to the body, this is the in-sweep or the heel. As we move up, you'll note that the width across gets smaller as we move towards the neck. This portion is the shoulder, so from the body to the shoulder to the neck, much like a human body's anatomy. And then up at the top, this entire area is known as the finish, composing of both the lip and the collar. And what you'll see tonight is that looking at that one particular region, the finish, and certain characteristics of the finish will do a great deal in telling you the date in which your bottle was made, or the general range, I should say.
So pay attention to the base. We're going to talk more about that. And then over here where it says raised embossing inside of plate, there are what they call slug plates, and we'll discuss that a little bit, that allow the bottle to have the embossing that gives you the name of the product and possibly who the manufacturer was. And then as Alex says, when we get to the top, that also adds to another layer of understanding the history of the bottle.
We're going to be referencing these throughout the show. You want to talk a little bit about these?
These are 6 bottles. And they're all from the same druggist. And they all have something that's specifically different about them. And by the end of the show, we should be able to discuss why or how to put them in numeric order. So they'll be reoccurring from time to time.
So with that, we come to question number 1. Does the bottle have raised embossing on the base, body, and or shoulder, or the neck? And most importantly, does the bottle have a distinct vertical side mold seam visible on the body, shoulder, or neck?
Yeah, that vertical side seam, we're going to be talking about that. But when we talk about raised embossing, here's a bottle that clearly has ridges that are along the side over here. Now that doesn't necessarily indicate the age of a bottle, because I can tell you these, what they call cathedral bottles over here, are much older and certainly much more valued in terms of the artistry. So we'll be talking about what these different molds mean and how they indicate the age.
Now, if I draw your attention to the screen, we'll have the first, you might say, lesson in dating bottles. So quite clearly indicating what you can see the side mold seam. These mold seams are where 2 parts of the bottle molds would have come together when forming a piece of this antique glass. And you might say the fingerprint of that is the side mold seam. Now, in this particular example, if you look up towards the top, you'll note that the side mold seam vanishes towards a point as we head towards the finish. It thins out. Now this tells us the bottle was known as it's made blown in a mold, sometimes using the acronym of BIM. What's important is that these bottles blown in a mold, and we'll learn why that seam fades out later, these are generally made prior to 1903.
Alex, can you just tone down your mic a little tiny bit more?
Now at this next example, we can see a bit of a transition. Again, we have a side mold seam. But if we continue all the way to the very top, the mold seam does go all the way to the very top of the finish. This bottle was made in a machine. The term blown in a mold seems to indicate there was some, you might say, human involvement, some process by hand in which the bottle was molded. This example made entirely by machine, the automatic bottling machine. Actually, we'll be seeing that later. So bottles like this, where the mold seam goes all the way to the top, made after 1903, technique known as machine made.
Right, so that's our first date that we want you to be aware about, 1903. So whenever you have that seam go all the way to the top. Now the thing that you want to understand is that they didn't stop doing the old-fashioned ways at 1903 just because the automatic bottle machine came on the scene. There were a lot of other factories that could not afford, and we're going to see this machine later on in our show. So it's possible to have a bottle going into the 20s or the 30s that are still using the old-fashioned hand-blown method.
Now for question number 2, the most important part of this question is talking about the ground lip. Is there a finish or a rim on the bottle? Is it ground down or not visibly ground down? Meaning, does it or does it not have a ground lip or rim?
So as I come by over here, you can just run your fingers across the edge over here and you can feel how with, just on the edge, right on the edge up here. Yeah, not on the inside, but right on the edge. You can feel a little bit of roughness to it. And that was ground down with like a sandpaper kind of product. And then they would use a rubber washer. Those were generally done with wider bore bottles.
And so the term wider bore bottle, that indicates, you might say, the width of the throat or the opening of the bottle. These are generally being used for food products, primarily also mason and fruit jars, which you can see clearly on the screen here. This also having a ground lip rim. As you felt, it has a bit of a coarse abrasive texture, but nothing terribly sharp, but it is definitely different compared to what you'll see later, some of these smoother topped bottles, like a typical blob top soda or a crown top bottle that we'll be seeing later throughout the program tonight. Now on to question number 3. This is where details and fine eyesight begin to get more so important. Is the bottle cylindrical? Is it round? Does it have a symmetrical shape? And most importantly, are there faint concentric rings around the body or the bottle, as well as of the shoulder as well? That's the best example right there, actually, in my opinion.
Right, and it's very hard, you know, what you'll see as you look through this and you hold it at the light at a certain point, that there are rings going around this way on the bottom. So what happens is that after the bottle is made and you have this long side seam, some of the manufacturers wanted to get rid of that. So they would take very wet old newspapers and they would put it down and they would twist the bottle while it was still molten hot. That would erase the side seams, but it would create these vertical seams. And we're going to learn about the dating of those vertical seams in just a moment.
Now this technique is known as the creation of a bottle in a turn paste mold. And this technique is generally popular from 1880 through 1915, particularly on more so these wine-style bottles. That's more of an unusual style of a blob top bottle, probably made for a beer or a soda. Not as common to see the turn paste characteristics on a style like that, but you can again see the faint concentric rings on this wine bottle on the screen. Now there are a few, you might say, variations on the topic of a turn paste mold. One of my favorites is the concept of a dip mold, which uses the same characteristic in, you might say, the bottom portion of a bottle mold, and in the ability, I should say, take out the master ink actually. When, you might say, extracting the bottle from the mold, the sides, the walls, you should say, of the mold, they're at an angle to ensure that when the bottle is pulled out, the glass does not sag at all or deform when it is extracted.
If it was parallel, it would drag as it was being pulled out, but because the base is narrower than the top, it easily comes right out. Now sometimes these are very subtle in terms of difference between the size of the base and the shoulder. So what you can do, it doesn't show up as well on a carpeted floor, but if you go to a tile floor and you simply roll the bottle, if you see it starting to veer off to a side, you know that you have an example of a dip mold. Now the term dip mold is actually something that's even done today in a lot of art glass. If you've watched any of those programs on PBS, Craft in America, they show the not glass manufacturing, but people who make art glass pieces. They have all sorts of very interesting shaped kinds of molds that they'll blow into. As a matter of fact, at this time of the year, you'll start seeing pumpkin molds. You know, you'll see these glass pumpkins. They're generally started in a mold that has very sharp angles, and they blow it, and then they pull it out, and then they start making it rounder, and it begins to take on the appearance of a pumpkin. And that's what they use a dip mold for. This particular one has a 3-part. You can see that there's, well, you probably can't see, but I'll show you that there is a line on the top.
We have some pictures as well, because that brings us into our next part. So Victor referenced the term. Just to reference again, these dip mold bottles, common from right after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1870. They're often used, though, in, you might say, tandem with another bottle production technique, and that is the 3-piece or the 3-part mold. You might ask what exactly that terminology stands for. Well, if you look there, the mold line creates a very convenient T-shaped formation right here along the shoulder. This bottom portion, this is the first part of the mold, could be a dip mold, and then the 2 upper parts come together and form that T shape, hence the name 3-part mold. That example of a master ink, just a little bit of some terminology. If you've ever been at a flea market or a yard sale and you see those neat cone-shaped ink bottles, this is what you would have filled up those ink bottles with. That would have been filled with ink back in the day. These 3-part molds, though, very popular on cylinder whiskey bottles, which is what's pictured on the screen, and they're generally popular from 1870 through 1910. So we can see just in this one portion, with that master ink on the screen, the dip mold being a bit of an earlier technique from right after the Civil War, with the 3-part mold being a more of a layer style, because they combine both. We're looking right around the 1870 period for that one example that was just shown to all of you. Now there's yet another theme on this, particularly moving into the 1870s and 1880s, which is going to give us a little bit of a look into the rather harsh environment that was the period glasshouse.
So now this particular picture, this is from 1908. It's an image from a West Virginia glass factory and shows the gaffer. Now the gaffer is the gentleman with the long pole, or the tube that's going down to the ground over there. Now he is at work with what's known as his shop crew, and that includes a mold tender boy to the lower right, and he has a set of tongs in his right hand. Now behind the blower is a gatherer, or behind the gaffer, and he has a glob of glass for the gaffer on the second blowpipe. And what he's doing is he's adjusting the temperature of that glass by rolling it back and forth on a marving board. All right, and then of course off to the side we have somebody who does the snapper up. He has a snap case tool, and that's going to be very important in just a moment. And the caption of this photo says, "Glass blower and mold boy." Now listen to this. The boy has 4.5 hours of work at the stretch, then an hour's rest, and 4.5 more. He's in that cramped position for 9 hours a day. And during 1 week, he'll do a night shift. Another week, he'll do a day shift. And when we see a video later on, you're going to see some of the dangers and hazards that particular boy is involved with. Alex does a wonderful lecture on the Ellenville glass factory, the glassworks. And there's one part of that particular lecture that he talks about that Ellenville factory wanted to pay the apprentices, because the apprentices up until then got nothing for 9 hours a day. Just for the hope of possibly eventually growing up to being a glass blower, because they did get paid well. Well, the glass blowers were angry. They said, no, we had to be apprentices for no money, and we expect them to do the same, which was, I think, an unfair statement at that time, or any time. Anyway, going on.
The particular point of interest, we referenced the snapper upper and the snap case tool, which we'll take a bit of a look at here. And this would have been used to, you might say, hold the bottle while the topper finish was being applied, right after it came out of the bottle mold. And bottles that have had the snap case tool used on them, they have a rather peculiar characteristic. If you compare here, you can see how the 2, you might say, handles along the side, the 2 clasps would have been rather tightly focused around this particular bottle. And the bottle here is still fresh out of the mold, somewhat warm and characteristic. Those metal clasps would have left mild indentations along this side. And if you indeed hold a bottle that has been used with a snap case tool, you can still feel those indentations or grooves along the side.
If you keep your hand open, let me just roll it, and you'll feel that one side is narrower than the other. And that narrow part is where the snap case tool was holding on to the bottle. So just let me roll it as you hold down, and you can feel it, how it goes in and out.
Oh yeah.
So those are the little stories you begin to tease out of the bottle. You begin to find, along with the seams, other bits of evidence that begin to tell us the age and the manufacturing style of the bottle.
Now on to question number 4, and this is quite a popular topic for us bottle collectors. Does the bottle have some type of pontil scar or a pontil mark? Now the pontil, just for some clarification, is a technique generally used prior to the Civil War. We saw the snap case tool before as a means of perhaps holding a bottle while the finish or the rim is being applied. This is perhaps the predecessor to that. The bottle itself would have actually been held by what is known as a punting rod. That's being held by this gentleman here while the lip or rim is being applied. And once the application of the finish is complete, the punting rod would have been broken off from the bottom, and it leaves a scar or a mark in the form of a pontil scar. What was just showed to the audience, that is known as an open pontil scar. It's arguably the most common of the different scars. It is a direct glass connection to the base, and it leaves a bit of jagged glass in that location. And sometimes it's often mistaken as actually thinking the bottle is broken. It's indeed not the case, and you wouldn't believe how us collectors get quite excited after seeing a pontil scar like this at an antique show or a flea market or a yard sale. And now on this topic, there's quite a unique story we have here of a bit of a, you might say, tie-in with another bottle story.
So Alex got this particular bottle back when he was working at an auction house, and a friend of his had bid on a lot which had a collection of all sorts of assorted bottles. And when the gentleman went to pay for the bottles, he saw Alex and he says, "You know what, Alex, why don't you take this one?" Now at the time, we thought that this was maybe some very early, maybe Revolutionary War kind of bottle, because the base is just really awful. It can barely stand up straight. And we were giving this lecture in Poughkeepsie, right?
Yes.
And one very nice gentleman, and I have to really underscore very nice, because sometimes collectors can be very nasty with their information. He raised his hand and he says, "You know what, I think that might be a saddle flask." And I thought, how sweet. He first said, "I think." He didn't challenge, he just wanted to contribute, which I thought was fabulous. So we went home, we studied, and we said, yeah, you know what, this is a saddle a saddle flask. And saddle flasks are predominantly from Persia and go from 1600 to about 1800. And think about it, if you're a Bedouin traveling in the desert, you don't really need a flat-bottom bottle to go into the sand. Matter of fact, it's hard to get a flat-bottom bottle because it has to move the sand to adjust to it. But this kind of round bottom, you put it right in, it stands right up.
It's not American then.
No, it's not American. Not American. And that's what really threw us. Now this little decoration on the top, it's very common, and you'll see them on all these bottles. Matter of fact, there's about 5 or 6 of these right now on eBay. And you would put a rattan cover on it, and then they would wrap it around, and it would lock in with the little ornamentation that they have here around the neck. So really, you know, it's a very thoughtful bottle. There are copies out, and so you need to be careful. The bottom is very heavy with glass. You can see sort of some of the old, I don't want to say sloppy, but the old artistry of making it. You'll also notice there are a lot of larger bubbles in here. And the evidence of large bubbles is generally, not always, but generally an indication of age. And then you can see how rough hewn the top over here is. This would be called a tooled top. There are 2 ways you can do a finish. You can do it either applied. This is if you're doing it by hand. Applied means you take extra glob of glass, and we're going to show that in a moment. Or you can take the existing glass and make a lip out of it. So anyway, it's one of our favorites. We really do enjoy this particular bottle.
And that again, having an open pontil, as shown before. Now there are 2 other variations we'll be sharing on the pontil theme. The other of those is the iron pontil, which can be indicated by the remains of graphite that is left on the base compared to a jagged piece of glass. On this example, the graphite has faded away a great deal, but it is still certainly, you might say, a bit of a definable residue on the base.
Yeah, so the oxidation of the iron on the pontil rod does leave that evidence behind. So we've got 2 different kinds of pontils now. We have the open face pontil that I just came by with the older Persian glass, and the iron pontil, which we have over here.
And then there is the sand pontil, and these are perhaps the hardest to identify, but if you feel the base, not only is it going to be rather rough to the touch, but you'll still actually feel some grains of sand embedded in the base.
Yeah. So each one of these 3 depict a different manufacturing style. One of the things that we need to do, we started working on it, we have a plastic bottle, and we wanted to just show how complicated, you can feel the little roughness to it, how complicated this was. I mean, you have one of the workers with a pontil over here, standing over there, rolling the bottle back and forth, and then you have the gaffer with a tool that we're going to be seeing shortly that goes into the throat, and then he squeezes it in order to form the different tops. How they did this, to me, is just simply amazing.
Now, with pontils, the key absolutely is dates. Like the mold seams we saw before, it's perhaps one of the other most important figures for identifying and dating antique glass bottles. Generally speaking, the open pontil, which is the first example with that direct glass connection, generally 1865 or earlier, so prior to the Civil War. That iron pontil with the graphite residue, that's from 1845 until about 1870. And then the sand pontil from the 1830s through the 1850s. Now with all these dates, what important American historical event do you see that they all end right around? There you go. So generally speaking, if you have a bottle with a pontil scar, it is going to be from right at the Civil War period or before. After the Civil War, pontils on these more utilitarian style bottles vanish with time.
And by the way, downstairs in our house, we have a wonderful collection of some Mexican glassware, contemporary works, about 1970. They're all pontil. So just because it has a pontil on the bottom doesn't mean that it's back to before the Civil War. That's why it's important to ask numerous questions. Never go with just one answer. Ask a few different questions.
And then no pontil scar, generally speaking, again, 1865 or later, again, asking all the questions necessary. A lot of our details tonight, they regard utilitarian style bottles, these of course being examples that were used every day, and almost every day, I should say, during their time, and most importantly, thrown out generally after they were used, and then sometimes dug up in the ground for us bottle collectors to enjoy. With certain topics such as art glass, these older techniques have persisted and you might say have beaten the test of time. That brings us to question number 5. This one also very important. Does the bottle finish? There are 3 terms. Is it applied, is it tooled, or is it perhaps a finish that may not feature either of these categories? And we're just going to go through a bit of an overview, starting with the applied top. So when a bottle is made in a bottle mold, it naturally does not have a lip or a finish, particularly one that might be molded to a certain style of top, such as a crown top, which we'll be seeing eventually. That extra piece of glass has to be either formed or applied. Now in the first topic, known as applied, much like the name indicates, there's actually an extra piece of glass that is literally applied to the top, an extra piece of molten glass. And the indicative factor of that, because the glass is molten, it is still solidifying over time, and you're going to see that the molten glass has sagged a little bit in a term known as slop over before formally solidifying alongside the neck. And we do have some examples here of slop over. This one, though, shows the other indicative factor of a bottle that has a applied top. This is a early beer bottle from the Deer Park Brewery of Port Jervis, New York in western Orange County. And it's interesting, it has a crown top, which is very indicative of, in later in time, these crown tops for soda bottles, even of the 1950s and 60s, perhaps during your childhood, you remember them with the metal caps. This one, though, is blown in a mold, so it is a blown in a mold crown top from probably about 1895 or 1896, and it's just being shown. I think the term crack was being used.
Well, it was. I'm sorry. There's what we call a burst off. So there's a couple different steps with this bottle. And originally this bottle was first in a mold, it was blown, and then at the top, and we're going to see this coming up soon, it would break off. So when you look at this particular top over here, you can see that there's this line, a jagged line that goes all the way through. And then what happens is that they've applied additional glass here. And then with that additional molten glass, they put their shaping tool in there and they spun it. And then they ended up with something like this. But it doesn't hide the fact that this was first a burst off. And what I like about this is a really interesting bottle in a couple different ways. But this is a very familiar kind of top. We've seen this all the time. Anyone who's ever had a bottle of beer, this is known as a crown top. Crown top started, what, about
1892.
1892. So we're pretty sure that this is on the early side of crown tops because of the way that it was made. There are other questions that we'll answer with this bottle coming up real soon, too.
Now here in this case, and this starts to have our discussion of what we're going to call cathedral pepper sauce bottles. This could have been used for anything such as a ketchup or another type of condiment. And it has a few characteristics on this topic. If you look at its finish, not only will you see the jagged remains of the original burst off top, but you'll also see the glass sagging in slop over mode here.
So you can see the jaggedness underneath, inside of that top, and then you can see there's a little bit of slop over. What's really neat, this bottle came to us by way of...
It was by way of a collection in Wappingers Falls.
Sorry?
What is it, a ketchup bottle?
You know, this is what more like a pepper sauce, like an A1 sauce. You know, so that's what would be the product commonly known here. But there was this one bottle that I saw on Craigslist.
Yes.
And Alex collects milk bottles. He has probably the finest collection of Orange County milk bottles anywhere known. And Orange County has a very important history in terms of milk in New York City, which is another long story, and he does a great lecture on that as well. But there was one bottle there, so I went and I got it. And in that particular batch was this bottle. And at the time, it really didn't register with me. Alex immediately saw something in it, and there was another collector friend of ours who, when he saw the collection we had got, said, "Oh, this is a beauty." And it is a beauty, as you noticed before. He said it's real artwork. You know, these bottles really speak to the artistry of its time. So anyway, having said that.
Now here, this is another neat piece. This doesn't exactly go much into the burst off top, but for one, you'll notice the beautiful color on this early blackening or style of shoe polish. And if we take a look at its finish, this can be clearly seen. Note it has many air bubbles, but they've all been skewed in a certain direction. And so as that applied top is being applied, the edges of the glass are actually being shifted in a certain direction. It goes to show almost the dramatic nature of early bottle making.
I have about 6 of these.
Really? What we love about this is the color, but more importantly, every one of these diagonal lines, those were initially tiny, tiny bubbles. And as the glass was being stretched, and you could almost hear it almost creaking, it's pulling all those bubbles and creating these wonderful diagonal striations. When I first saw this bottle, it was the drama that was revealing to me that was so important. You know, seeing that. And then, as some of you might see, is that the line we were talking before in the beginning, the side seam, you can see towards the very top.
That's a nice color.
It is a beautiful color, isn't it? And sometimes color is the dominant factor in people's... there are people who only collect milk at magnesia bottles because they love the blue. You know, which you can also get the bromoseltzer bottles. You know, they have the same blue. But anyway, this is such a cool bottle. There was an auction for this one, and I bought more than enough tickets to make sure that we got it.
So how do you get the color into them?
Oh, color is a whole separate thing.
And it's coming up in one of our questions in this area.
Okay, great.
Yes. We're going to talk about one factor of color, too, that's particularly interesting very soon. Now, the other topic, these are all applied tops. That's where the extra piece of glass is at. There's another topic known as tooling. And tools, you might say bottle making tools, can be used on the applied tops, but sometimes they're also used to form, you might say, tops on the existing glass. And this is a great example. These early bottle tools and the molds often didn't survive the test of time. If anyone here has been to the National Bottle Museum in Ballston Spa, New York by Saratoga Springs, they have a great collection of bottle tools. The example here would have been used for a cylinder whiskey style top, and if we actually compare the two, you can see this indentation that would line up right to here. So this would have gone into the orifice, and then these two parts on the outside, these you might say clamps, would have come together, and then the bottle would be turned, forming that top.
So as it's turning, what is it erasing? The side seam. But here again, this is the bottle that I showed you earlier that had the snap case, the indentation. So you've got the snapper individual holding the bottle and rolling it back and forth on the margin table. And then the glass blower takes this particular portion down the throat of the bottle, and then the outer section he squeezes as it's rotating in order to form the shape of the lip, removing the side seam, and does it within a few seconds because he doesn't have a whole lot of time to do this.
So generally speaking, on some dates, if you have that applied finish, again, that's the extra piece of glass added. That can be from the early 1800s to the late 1800s. A tool finish, that's with the tool usually forming the remaining glass. Mostly common starting in the 1870s with drugstore bottles. Can be seen on larger bottles like that cylinder whiskey into the 1880s and 1890s. And then we get the burst off finish, that is the raw burst off finish from the 1890s into 1920. These are particularly common on English ink bottles, very utilitarian in nature, and really leaving that very crude finish along the rim or surface.
So if you put your fingers right on the edge, it's not sharp so that it'll, but what you can see is that they really didn't bother to make a finished lip on this one.
What's worth more, ink bottles or?
These are ink, yes.
They all worth more money.
I wouldn't say value is a...
Classification doesn't necessarily mean the value. It's the story that the bottle has. And you mentioned color. Color is one of the... No, if this was green...
I don't have that color. I have a lot of
amber?
like a blue.
Okay.
I found, One day somebody gave them to me.
Yeah, there's an aqua, which falls in that blue. Aqua is a very prominent color before the turn of the century, on up to about 1920, and that's more indicative of some of the impurities of the glass in the area that would create that particular color.
Actually, straining towards aqua is actually, you might say, most sort of the natural color of glass. What we'll learn later is that glass is not naturally clear.
And we're going to talk about how that
creating
happens.
it clear does leave some, you might say, effects that help you to date things.
Now, with this particular bottle, you know, some people would ask, well, why didn't they do a finish? Well, this was a utilitarian bottle. It was purely meant to hold ink.
And
All right,
to
that
throw
was
out
the
when you were done.
That was the computer of its day. That was the printer of its time. So it was just purely used in order to hold the ink. And then when the ink was running low, they would probably have another larger bottle like this one over here that we showed earlier that has that little pour spout over here. So they would take it and they would pour it into the bottle, and that would be it. And then you have probably a little cork in there to seal if there's extra.
He was going to use cork.
Most likely, most
Yes.
likely.
Now we're going to talk about the burst off in the context of the video we have here.
Remember about that boy? 4.5 hours on, then he gets an hour break, 4.5 hours on. He's got 9 hours a day. 1 week he's during the day and 1 week is at night. All right.
Keep
Watch
an eye
carefully.
right here.
This is when we need OSHA.
You can see there's some glass being rolled on the marking table. It's now going to go into the bottle mold shortly.
Okay, he's trying to get the glass to the right consistency. He's in the mold now. Look at the bubble. Pop.
We can
That
watch
boy is
again.
probably about 2 feet away from where that glass is popped.
No goggles.
No.
Goggles. None at all. Now I'm going to come by with a bottle that has some of those popped shards on its shoulders.
No, you just missed it. It was the cylinder.
The cylinder. This one?
Yep.
Where did I see it? Oh yeah, I do. I'm sorry. If you look at the neck over here, you'll see some of those shards right there. So when this got popped, some of the shards landed right over there, and then immediately after, this was applied lip, so they applied additional glass on top, but you can see the shards right from the pop. So that's evidence of a burst off. Even though that evidence was covered over with the glob. And if you look also at the glass over here, you'll see little tiny lines at a diagonal. Again, it indicates that as it was being turned, it was pulling that glass that was already cooling down. So you can almost sense that drama in this bottle over here. You can't feel it, but it's
Star on it too.
It does.
Special.
It does. It is.
Now you're right next to another bottle we're going to be discussing on this topic for number 6. Does the bottle have mold seams within the base or the extreme outside edges of the base? That's going to be for the one medicine bottle we're just holding off to the right.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
And so this will be talking about base mold seams. We've already talked about side mold seams, but when those molds come together, they do usually leave a mold across the base as well. Now, with this example of a rather plain style medicine or drugstore bottle, it's a little interesting. It has a few details on an otherwise rather plain site at first. For one, you'll see a large amount of what we call seed bubbles, these very small air bubbles along the body and the neck as well. But if we take a look at its base, it also has a base mold seam running directly across, as well as an open pontil scar. So this base would have come together, and then while the pontil was being formed, the punching rod would have been broken off, leaving that open pontil scar along the base.
So we see two things going on with this bottle. We see that it's a 2-part mold, like a clam mold.
Correct, yes.
And it also has the open pontil scar over here.
And now there are some variations on this, like the other topics we've seen. One of them is known as a post-molded bottle, which we have right here. And this incorporates almost what you could call some embossing into the base, usually to have some manufacturer's information. And you can see that detail right here.
So you've got this seam, the mold seam, and then in the middle, it's like a coin that indicates who the manufacturer was on this particular bottle. So it's kind of hard to see. It's got 2 lines here from the mold, and then a coin over here.
And these post-molded bottles generally being used from the 1850s until 1890. We see there's no pontil scar though, so that means we're after the Civil War. So generally from probably more from 1870 until 1890.
I would say though, I haven't thought definitely about this, but the bottle seems to be compressed in the middle, so this could have been used with a snap case tool as well. So we'd have to discuss that and look at that further. One of the neat things about this bottle, I'm sorry Alex, I know he gets a little bit annoyed because sometimes I keep talking. But on the inside over here, there is this thread. And I didn't realize this until, you know what, you're looking at a bottle, you're thinking about it, you're trying to see just by touch sometimes what it says. And as I put my pinky inside, I've noticed, wait a minute, as I turn the bottle, my pinky's being pulled in. You're a little collector. I know that you've got some bottles that you want to show us. Right. Well, we're going to learn about those a little bit later. We even have an example of one bottle over here that even has its own internal thread stopper.
Before they came out with extra.
That's
Correct,
right.
yes.
Sorry, Alex, I took them all on a little trip.
Oh no, that's not a problem at all. We always enjoy, these are all about combining different facts together.
Can I ask
And
you,
Oh, sorry, question.
yes,
I was taught, as I say, I'm a clock collector, but somebody had told me if you see more than one mold, 3 molds, like let's say a kerosene lamp. I have a couple with 4 different lines in it. They said that's earlier than a 2-piece. Does it apply to the bottle too? You follow what I'm saying?
I would only say that's not always true because remember there were 6 bottles in the beginning that we showed on the screen that were from one druggist. One of the middle bottles actually has 2 separate seams. We're going to talk about that. There's an offset seam at the top and then there's a side seam. And that's because the process for making bottles changed in 1903 with, well, we'll talk about him later, right?
we will talk about it very soon. I would also argue not always the case. I would say if you had fewer mold seams originally, before the time of bottle molds, which generally speaking is a relatively newer concept in the history of glass making, all this glass was free blown. Just like that Persian saddle flask, there were no bottle molds. That was blown relatively freely with the art of hand, as it still would be today. The earlier bottle molds were rather crude, and they would have only had generally the 2 side mold seams. And it wasn't later in time until I'd say after the Civil War era where you start getting multiple mold seams. Though I'm sure there might be exceptions to the rule.
Do you collect also railroad lanterns?
I had a couple, those are gone.
Okay.
I'm a collector of about 30 years of everything.
You know, collectors kind of bleed into different territories. I understand your illness. There's a 12-step program. We talk about that on our next show.
Yeah,
Let's take a little bit of time to talk about the cup molded base.
Okay. So anyway, there are some bottles that have a flat base. I have an example over here. Let me just, oh, it's right here, I'm sorry. This has a flat base. You'll find some bottles like that. I don't think there was ever really a manufacturing process that's distinctly said we're making bottles with a flat base. I think generally most people stayed with the cup shape idea because that's the most stable way. With a flat base bottle, what ends up happening, it's very hard to get all of the different glass to be, first of all, even and to dry evenly or cool down evenly so that it'll be flat. So what you have with bottles like this is that they tend to be a little wobbly. This one's not particularly bad. But in order to have a more secure finish, manufacturers adapted what's known as a cup-shaped base, where the outer rim sticks out further. And so this means you have less surface area touching the base, and it tends to be more solid sitting down. Not always the case, but the general rule is that it does.
And these cup-shaped bottles, they can sometimes be as early as 1850. That would have been during the Pontil era, but they're more common from the 1880s until 1910. And this is until the arrival of the ABM, or the automatic bottling machine. This is, again, one of the great trends that we've discussed prior. And this is before 1903. All bottles were made with some, you might say, hand-in process. This is the technique of blowing in a mold, with the glass blower directly blowing the molten glass into a bottle mold, seen here at the base. After 1903, Michael Owens of the Owens, Illinois Glass Company patents the automatic bottling machine, which totally mechanized the entire process. In fact, you can see the original machines were so large, they had to be housed on railway tracks. We're even fortunate to have a video of one of these machines at work.
So this would take about half of the room space over here. And if you look off to the side, you see that one on the lower left, it's the section that's falling down. I think in another 2, we're going to start seeing bottles coming out. All right, starting now, I believe. 1, 2. Every 2 to 3 seconds, let me see. 2, 2, 3. 3, 2, 3. 4, 2, 3. Now, there's no way that you're going to be able to do that with the old-fashioned lip tools and get that many bottles out. And by the way, that's Mr. Michael Owens right over there.
Now, for question number 7, are there mold-formed, this is interesting, are there air venting marks on the shoulder, body, and or base of the bottle? This is another great little technique for dating and something that is much best felt compared to being seen. So these, yes.
Okay. These are really hard to show, and you can only see them by feeling them with your fingernails. You have to sort of run across over there, so I'm just going to ask you to believe me. The other thing is that they're also symmetrical because you'll find one on the other side in the same exact location. These are called air vents. Oh, right over here, right at this spot over there. A little tiny bump. And again, it's not just simply one alone. Generally, you'll find them in a symmetrical location. All right? It's just right over here. Just a little tiny bit. You gotta use your nails. You can barely feel it with your fingers. And I know our camera crew out here, it's very hard for me to show you, but it's right at this spot right over here. There's a spot here, and then in the front, there's a similar spot. Oops, I lost it. Right over there. And these tiny holes would allow gases to escape. So think about it, particularly let's say in the early part of the day, when you're first starting up your batch of glass, you've got a very hard batch of about 2,500 degrees glass. You've got these iron molds. The connection of the cold molds with the very hot glass creates gas. And then that creates kind of like a wavy finish in the glass. I don't think I have a good example, unfortunately. But in order to try to combat that, to keep it more uniform and clear, because we're now entering a period where we're beginning to see grocery stores. And when you go to the grocery store or the pharmacy, you want to see what the product is. All right, and so that's where even we were talking about color. We're going to be talking about how to get glass to be clear. What kind of cleansing agents do you use to make it? So those are all part of the evolution of the market.
So if you have air vents, just perhaps 1 or 2, as you saw in these examples, these are actually also ink bottles from a drugstore in Taunton, Massachusetts. Just 1 or 2 air vents from the mid to late 1880s until the 1890s. Then if you have multiple, they will come from 1905 into 1920. So then again, these air vents, generally indicative of bottles from the late 19th into the early 20th century. Now for question number 8, does the bottle have embossed or labeled contents or volume capacity information? And this is something that's commonly seen on your ink bottles at times, as well as most prominently any types of food product bottles. So this includes milk bottles, as well as any condiment jars, for example. And so if there is volume capacity information, this was mandated in 1914. This is in compliance with the Gould Amendment of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. Now this brings up an interesting point. Is it possible to find a bottle made prior to 1914 that has capacity information on it? Of course it is. However, if you find one that does not, you will know very quickly it comes from prior to 1914.
Now, Alex, you should also mention if you see a bottle that says Cure.
That's another bit of an interesting thing in regards to the 06 Pure and Food Drug Act, which prohibited the use of the word cure on bottles with patent medicines that were probably composed of more alcohol than anything else. That word was banned after 1906. So if you have a Cure bottle of some kind, that is prior to 1906.
And we know somebody who's probably got the greatest collection of Cure bottles in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yes, we do.
Fabulous collection.
So just touching on this topic of capacity information, we'll compare 2 milk bottles from the same dairy farm. This is the Arden Farms Dairy Company of Arden, New York in southeastern Orange County. It was one of the largest firms in the region, operated by railroad magnate E.H. Harriman. When you came to my lecture last week, we talked about Harriman a little bit. This was his personal dairy farm. Now, this would have been one of his first milk bottles, probably from the mid-1890s, and you'll see nowhere are there any signs of capacity. There's no fluid ounce markings. But if we move about 30 years later into the early 1920s, there we have 1 quart liquid very clearly indicated. So 2 bottles from the same farm, one prior to 1914, the other post-1914. Now for question number 9, this talks a little bit about what you might think is one of the more logical ways in dating a bottle. Are there any types of maker markings embossed on the base or the body of your antique glass?
Well, we do get into that a little bit, and I'm just going to accompany this talk with, over here, we have this book by Toulouse called Bottle Makers, which is a very popular book. It's used by many collectors. Like any book, or any encyclopedia, the moment it's written, it's out of date. So this book goes up to, I believe, 1972, and we're going to talk a little bit further on in our story here how this particular book gives us the information, but not the complete picture. So again, just like you want to do one more or additional questions in terms of finding the approximate date of your bottle, you want to use multiple resources in terms of nailing down. Now, one of the resources I gave you in the beginning, SHA, Society for Historical Archaeology, if you put SHA bottles, it'll take you to their site, and on their site, they actually have a complete collection of bottle makers with their logos and what years they were in operation.
Now let's look, talking about resources, let's go through here to discuss. This comes from, the author's name is Gerard, and it's called Milk Bottle Makers and Their Markings. And we'll use his reference just to go through comparing these markings to the milk bottles of Hervey D. Thatcher's Thatcher Manufacturing Company. He was so revered, he's often mistaken for inventing the first glass milk bottle. The company of his name probably produced well over 90% of the nation's glass milk bottles. Now we'll see the earliest markings using the T Manufacturing Company symbol with apostrophes, generally from about the 1890s through 1917, used on this early style milk bottle from Brooklyn. Now if we come into the early 1920s, it changes just to TMC with periods you can see after each initial, visible on the, I should say, insweep or the heel of this example of a quart-sized milk bottle from Montgomery, New York in Orange County. Now this one is a little interesting for a few reasons. It's from the Beeks Dairy Company in New York City. The company actually was founded in Orange County around 1878. You'll note it has a metal closure on top. This is known as a tin top, and this is the predecessor to the cardboard caps you might remember from the 1950s and 1960s. This bottle, though, it's particularly great to be using a tin top, and perhaps more interesting, it has two different identification markings on it. You'll see on the base it has T Manufacturing Company with periods, used from 1910 to 1924, but it also has the TMC monogram, used from 23 to 49. Well, note something interesting. There's a 1-year overlap from 1923 to 24. Quite a unique instance where we can pinpoint a bottle's manufacturing date directly to 1 year of likely around 1923 or 1924. Now this TMC monogram, it was used well after 1949, but with a slight variation. You can see it changes now to a triangle shape instead of the more square shape, used well into the 1970s. This again showing the value that these, you might say, more academic resources can have in helping to identify the date of your antique glass. Oh, now bottle color. This is a topic I think that is quite popular. And we're going to, in particular, be talking about clear glass. And the question is your color clear approaching amethyst or clear approaching a straw tint? And that's going to focus on an example like this here. So as mentioned before, glass is not naturally clear. And to make it clear, it needs to have what you might call a cleansing agent. And prior to World War I, that cleansing agent was the element manganese. And a natural property of manganese is when left in sunlight, it'll naturally turn amethyst. The term is often called SCA, or sun-colored amethyst glass. And there's a few interesting features of SCA glass. And you know what I want to do? I'm going to compare it, yes. That one example from the Deer Park Brewery with the others seen here. This is also a bottle that has manganese in its glass, but you notice it's a far darker shade of purple. You might be wondering, has it been left out in the sunlight longer? You could possibly say that as interpretation. What's actually done is someone has forcibly subjected that one dark purple bottle to a high dosage of light.
So this particular bottle in my left hand, this is the color that the manufacturer originally wanted. That's what we call the cobalt blue.
That's cobalt blue, yes.
This over here is a heavily irradiated bottle, which took the manganese. It was originally a clear bottle, but it was, the term the collectors like to use is nuked. It was nuked heavily with ultraviolet light to turn it into this purple. There are bottles right now on eBay that say very rare purple bottle. No. It's a regular bottle that you put through ultraviolet light. It's not a rare color. It's just simply a process.
And so we'd like to touch on this topic just in case you're perhaps at the Stormville Flea Market or somewhere else locally and you see a bottle like this trying to be sold as legitimate, but instead just for some reference that it has been, you might say, altered. The actual practice itself, It is contentious in the community. What is more contentious is obviously selling it as a quote-unquote legitimate example, even though it has been altered. Now, in terms of that cleansing agent topic, again, much of the world's manganese supply during this time came from Germany, and after the World War I period, around 1914, supply chain issues became quite a problem, so the cleansing agent was changed to selenium, which leaves a straw tint in the glass. And this is not affected by sunlight, it has a natural straw-like tint. And so, whether your glass has that bit of an amethyst haze or that straw tint is another great way to determine whether your bottle is dated from the turn of the 20th century or after World War I.
So when you see a bottle that has that amethyst quality, you know that it's most likely before World War I. Here again, we had the Civil War before with, in terms of Pontols. Here, color is indicated by World War I.
And just another quick note as well, that Deer Park Brewery bottle, that's about, I would say, the naturally darkest amethyst you will see in the wild, unaltered. I don't think I've ever seen a bottle darker than that example. So for reference, if you're exploring a, usually they're much more faint. Some of the other mustard bottles being held are more accurate examples, but that one beer bottle is particularly nice shade of amethyst.
So again, going back to this bottle, here's what I really find exciting about this whole process. It's not so much when we talk dollars and cents, but I can tell you that this has, remember earlier, a burst-off finish, because we can see that burst off through the applied lip that was put on there, and then we can see that there's this color, this amethyst. So we have a whole series of different questions that are being answered that tell us a little bit more about its history and its manufacturing process, which I think makes it interesting company.
I think we have time for one or two more questions before we play our little quiz at the end of the program. So start with number 11. Are there bubbles present in the glass? And if so, how many, what size, and what shape? And so bubbles can take many different shapes and sizes. As seen here, these are more what we would call seed bubbles, generally smaller in size, dotted all around this beautiful style of glass.
You can feel it.
But I'm going to recommend, after you share this one, that's probably a style, would you say, a kind of an early soda or beer? Oh, that one's even broken open.
Yes.
Okay.
You can feel that little jagged edge over there where the bubble on the surface, now this was naturally occurring. It does not really affect its value, but it tells us something about its age. It's just the bubble popped. It didn't get chipped. The bubble just popped right over there.
Now, in comparison to that, we also have, this is a pickle bottle, for reference, more of a plain style that can get much more innate. This has some rather large bubbles along its surface as well.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an amazement that none of these have broken open. The glass around them is quite thin. The glass on this, you can tell it's whittled glass as well. It's quite thin to begin with as well.
So glass production, generally by the time you get to about 1930, the issue of bubbles has been pretty much solved. But up until then, you'll see varying amounts of bubbles. That doesn't always give you a definite idea in terms of its age unless you ask other questions. And again, that's important. What are the other questions? Can we talk about number 12?
Yes, that's our final one. This is
Federal law prohibits the reuse of this bottle. What's all that about? All these bottles over here say federal law prohibits reuse. What's all this about? Anybody know? What was going on in 1920?
No booze.
Right. Prohibition. When did that stop? About 1939, I think. Why did it stop is a good question.
Because people wanted it to stop.
No, it was part of the Depression.
We get a little tax from it.
There you go.
Yeah.
The government said, hey, wait a minute, we're losing a lot of tax money over here, so let's legalize it.
Yeah.
Now they also thought, well, we don't want the moonshiners to have all these bottles that get, used.
Make it reused.
But what they didn't think is that Jack Daniels turns out a lot better quality than, Fred down the road. So people decided to just stick with Jack Daniels because you knew you wouldn't die from Jack Daniels. So, I mean, if you took too much of it, it would, but generally speaking. So the nice thing about something like this, these are not old bottles. We know that the Depression was, less than 100 years ago. But when people collect because of a certain time frame, do you have a picture of the...
Yes, I do.
This is a really cool thing. During Prohibition, you can get a prescription.
Right.
You've got pharmacists in your family. So they must have gotten a few of these along the way. And so they were filling up these little medicine bottles with whiskey. Because that was solving the problem at that time.
And this extending from 1935 to 64. So even the later end of these bottles, these are being used well into a time period that's only years ago, 50, 60 years ago, I should say, at this point.
So if you start collecting, I mean, you don't have to necessarily collect bottles that are 150 or 200 years old. You can collect bottles that hit a specific time period and then all the additional artifacts within that time period as well. You can become knowledgeable about it so that when you have friends over, you can say, hey, this is this and this is that and this is how it's related and this is how it came into being. So let's take a moment to review what we've learned from this little game. Well, we haven't played the game yet, have we?
No, but we're going to return back to these 6 Groves bottles.
Now, normally I have these bottles out, but they're in this box over here. We were running a little bit late getting here because there was this alarm that kept going off. But anyway, that said, these are the 6 Groves Tonic Chill bottles. Now, Groves at one time, by the way, sold more bottles than Coca-Cola. Think about that. He became fabulously wealthy on this product. This was for malaria. It was basically, a quinine mixture. I have the bottles arranged in order from its oldest to its youngest. Just looking at these bottles, can you give me one fact that might indicate why some are older and some are newer? Yes?
The top, that one's got a screw top.
Thank you very much. He caught that right off the bat. So these have threaded tops. And the other ones, they have what are known as the cork top. And as a matter of fact, pharmacists used cork tops pretty much up until the 1930s. All right, they didn't use the caps that we use. Oh, now we have those child protective ones. That's a whole different thing. Do you think another 100 years from now we're going to do a whole thing on plastic bottles? I don't know. All right, so we know that these 2 are older because they have threaded tops. We know that these 4 in the front are, these are newer. These 4 in the front, they are the older ones because they have cork tops. Let's move to the next scene. Here we look at the base now. So, looking at the base, on the far side, we have a cup-shaped mold with no explanation. And by the way, you know what? Oh, I'm missing my something here. Hold on. Shoot. This is embarrassing. I should have had this out.
Oh, your identification cards.
Yeah. Because I don't, unlike my son, I don't have an extraordinary memory. Give me just one second over here. Talk amongst yourselves while I go over here.
Well, we'll just review again the bases, and I'll actually pose to the audience. What are a few characteristics you notice on the screen as the moment?
It's very difficult to see what you got there.
Well, one of them has a...
Let's take a bit of a closer look in them. So we note initially there aren't any identifiable markings on the base here. But as we move forward, we start to have a few different things. For one, I'm going to bring your attention, you'll see 2 portions of what seems like a part of a circle along the edge. This is known as the Owens identification mark. I should say the Owens injector mark. So remember that automatic bottle machine used after 1903? When those bottles were punched out onto that little ramp, there had to be a part of the machine doing that, and that was what left that mark. And in fact, if you, we do have a bottle here later to show. If the edge of that mark is a little sharp, that usually indicates that the machine was not being maintained all that well. You'll also note a few different manufacturer markings, and this again, this coming from when you might say the point of these academic references are a little better. I don't have the dates off the top, but this N standing for the Port Glass Company. Now here with the diamond in the eye, this is just the Illinois Glass Company. Owens has not yet entered the picture. We'll note now we have the famous O diamond marking. This is the Owens Illinois Glass Company, very prominent through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And then we have the Ober-Nestor Glass Company, which plays into a bit of an interesting little fact about this book. If you look at Toulouse's book, it'll say the Ober-Nestor Glass Company is still in production. The copyright date is 1972, I believe.
I believe so, right.
And in 1978, the Ober-Nestor Glassworks goes out of business. So, of course, one of the many little details about combining different, you might say, sources into coming to a conclusion.
So now going back to the other 2, we see that we've got a tin top, but there's another difference over here. Here we have the embossing on the body of the bottle, but here there's only embossing on the shoulder. What's going on there? Can anybody give me an idea? Why would they suddenly shift the embossing to the shoulder as opposed to the body?
Cheaper on the shoulder, I would believe.
paper label.
Paper label, probably cheaper too, but paper label is right on. But I've also seen paper labels on bottles like this, because what will happen is that they'll maybe have 1,000 bottles left over from the last order, and they're getting new bottles coming in that are accepting paper labels. they don't care. They're going to put it on top of whatever bottle they got handy because they're selling that thing faster than Coca-Cola. So in order to move product, they would do that. Now these two bottles over here, this was the first two bottles in our line. You'll notice that they have a line going around the actual name of the bottle. That's a separate slug plate that would be put into the mold. And we know that it's a slug plate because it leaves that little hint behind, that line. So at that time, Groves wasn't sure how many bottles he needed. So he was using a slug plate because you would go to the manufacturer and the manufacturer says, you know, I've got enough to make 1,500 bottles today. And you know, Groves says, well, I only need 300. So, well, if you only need 300, we'll make you a slug plate. And that way somebody else who needs another 400, I can put their slug plate in. So that was just a way for the manufacturer to be flexible. But it also tells us that this is an early part of Groves' production. Going to the next bottle, we can see now how the line goes up, but then it suddenly disappears. So we know that these were blown in the mold. That's the earliest one. That was number 1.
Yes, this is again well prior to 1903.
And as we move on, we can see that the bottles over here, 2, 3, and 4, they have lines that go all the way on up to the top, except look at this one over here. This goes to the question somebody asked before. There's a line on the side, as well as a line on the side over here. That's a 2-part operation on the bottle making machine.
And here's a better look at that as well. You can see, again, to answer your question, here are the multiple different mold seams. And this example here is machine made, so this is after 1903. The mold seam on this case goes all the way to the very top of the bottle. This one here, blown in a mold, it ends right along the neck.
What I find interesting is that this one is a newer process. It's kind of a bulgy neck. The one over there, it's got a very nice straight neck. This one also, and I can't explain why, we know that this is not a burst off, but something did burst off in the process. So I'm not sure where that came from.
And now by this point, Groves is doing quite well as reference selling more of his product than Coca-Cola. You'll note there is no longer a slug plate. He now has a mold just for his own products that is going into production. He has become so confident that now he can make that 1,500 bottle order. And so these examples, the embossing is placed right onto the bottle itself. And then finally, of course, as referenced, here's where we come right to the top with just the embossing along the shoulder and no space for, I should say only space for a paper label. Now then we come to our final question, and that is, does your example of antique glass fail to resemble a bottle at all? I think several of us in the audience are cross collectors tonight, and this just goes to show the large, I like to say, array that antique bottle collecting has. Sometimes bottles can deviate quite a bit from what we might think of as the vision of an antique bottle, like this torpedo example in the upper left-hand corner. We have railroad lantern and bar lantern globes, topics of glass that often go hand in hand, as do glass telegraph insulators, is also a common cross-collectible, and glass paperweights. And with that, I conclude tonight's lecture with 2 notes. I didn't have time to set my display up, but I do have several publications authored by myself on local bottle collecting and bottle-related history that are available for purchase. And the main upcoming event I'm advertising is my special 11 o'clock to 2:30 performance on the Salon stage at the Town Crier Cafe in Beacon, New York. That's coming on Sunday, August 18th. So that is a week from this coming Sunday.
And that's
Thank you all.
wait, and that's just to repeat, he is going to Beacon not as a lecturer, but as a cellist who will be doing part of the British invasion, as well as, well, we haven't decided, from
I think we'll be
rock,
doing
I
that,
think.
yes.
So he's going to be doing a 2-part program there that day. Now, before we actually cut off, give me one particular bottle you want to talk about right now in your bag.
This one?
Well, we'll start with one.
These, I think, are re-pops, but this one here is the one. A whiskey bottle. Nope, it's not it.
Question.
That's okay.
Well, while he's looking, I had a question.
Sure.
What is the holy grail bottle you're
Here's what I think
looking
are all
for
good.
other than a milk bottle? Because I know you're a milk bottle collector, but
You know what? Personally, I can't say that I have a holy grail bottle I'm looking for in the area. Most of what you see here tonight, we haven't collected, and I say we because actually my father has done more of the searching than I have for these common
He's
pieces.
got the original labels, though. I'm sorry.
Oh no, not a problem.
go ahead,
All right.
you can answer my question afterwards.
So, okay, as we look at the bottle right here, I'm going to start first with the side seam, and we see that the seam does continue all the way on up, and it does even continue up through the lip over here. So we are looking at a bottle that is most likely maybe 1920, just based on that one fact
I have a
alone.
feeling it was, yeah.
Now, when we look at the base, you see this big circle over here? That's called the Owen scar, which we talked about.
Can I just see it for a second?
Sure.
It's old.
Oh yes, that is a, so this is, in fact, I actually think 1920 would be the latest. It's probably more around, I'd say 1950.
It had a liquor in it, believe it or not.
Oh, he had it when you, okay.
So here's another bottle that has a remnants of an Owen scar. This is a rough one, and rough is usually indicated the fact, or indicates the fact that the machinery was not being kept as well as it should. It shouldn't leave this kind of rough mark over here. But anyway, yours has two things.
Somebody had, I bought it, but basically the woman said she took the cork out and some liquid came out.
Well, you know it, you deal with that carefully. Yeah.
I like it because it has old crow on it and.
You know what, it's got a very nice Art Deco kind of design with the starburst patterns. It's certainly beautiful, and when you put these on a windowsill, I like to call these, you know, the poor man's stained glass window. It's a great way to make your diversions.
I figure about 1920.
I think
You're about right.
1920 the latest actually, it could
Yeah.
be earlier. It's a particularly nice early machine-made example.
One more bottle, give me another one.
Well, it's
This-
put that.
I say you got one there as well.
Okay, hold on to your thought while she gives me hers over
I
here.
I just
automatically-
like it for the subject matter too.
You like the cocaine?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we see that it's got a cup-shaped base, so we know that this is definitely after the Civil War, though the Civil War could have used probably some of that cocaine.
It's probably blown in a mold. from what I can see
It is
here.
blown on a mold, but you can see that towards the top, that the side seam is erased, so we know that we have, let's see, this applied, is this is kind of hard to tell whether it's
Can I
applied or
take a look?
tooled. You give me an idea. I'm thinking that might be tooled.
I think it's tooled. So from that, I would say combined with the factor of the cup base, which I'd say is very formal, and the blown lip, that's a very nice mold seam too, very easy to see. I would say it's a 1880s, 1890s mold
I was
seam.
going to say the same. And what's interesting, you have a really beautiful bubble over here that goes straight on up, so you can see that there was some pulling of that bottle, particularly at the neck. Sometimes if you look inside the bottle too, depending on how it's done, if on the burst off process, some of the shards fall down inside, and those are always neat. Okay, we've got a
English gin bottle.
gin
That
bottle.
is a case
exactly.
gin, yes.
Yeah, I'm not a big specialist on
My
gin
wife said,
bottles.
do not sell it because she'll divorce me.
She'll divorce you.
She likes it.
It's a nice color. Usually they're actually much darker shades of green. So I kind of like the lighter green shade.
Yeah, it
Is it, you
beautiful.
can't tell if it's blown?
I believe it is.
I would say it's blown too.
Yep. And you can see that the top over here's got some slop over.
Yes, that's applied.
So it was an applied lip on there. So we're probably talking at least, what, 1880 again?
At the probably 1870s, 1880s.
A little
I'd say.
earlier.
Really.
Yeah. Now again, this has, on the bottom of the base, it has either the number 11. I don't think it's two letters. So this would be probably a mold that the
Right.
manufacturer-
Usually, different molds have numbers to classify. That's usually common.
You should see the house in Peaksville that I went through. You would have died. They had glass everywhere.
Well, we want to thank you very much all for being here. Before we let you go, just to give you some additional information about Alex, if you're not familiar with his work, you have that one? Right.
They
This
were just
includes some of the
highlighted
organization.
You really don't have a holy grail bottle when you go.
I mean, in
to
terms
different-
of milk bottle
You
bunches,
consider that
yes.
So what's your milk bottle one then?
It's not Fidget Brothers.
No, but I do have some Fidget Brothers
I think it is.
examples.
but
Always.
I'm not positive.
You know, there's about 2 or 3 more from my town where I live that I'm still looking for. At this point, there are over 800 milk bottles in the house, and finding stuff.
All these
in
three
fact,
I got
it's
out of one
interesting.
place.
I just upgraded a particular bottle today that is quite hard to find, but finding things I need is getting harder to find. But at this point, beyond the fun of, and you could say the hunt of collecting, it's becoming more so a pleasure of looking beyond just the bottle itself as well as the history to how they were shaped and sharing that with an audience.
Right.
Which is really, most of the items here.
Hard for me to say.
we've
It's hard for
either,
me to say. I'm sorry, Alan.
No, I'm just saying most of the items here,
Come out of the same place.
we've either, they're either not very expensive, like for instance the
To me,
federal
they
law
look
for
too-
limits
I
for
think
use, those are not very valuable examples,
A lot of the items here I've actually just found in passing from purchasing larger
This would be
collections.
about,
I can think of
this
10 or
would be
11
about
bottles on this
1880.
table that
Really?
yeah.
we weren't looking for, but we had purchased a collection generally for milk bottles or something else in the region, and they just happened to be in there. Like even this
Isn't
example,
that weird? this
which,
one? 'Cause it has
talking
two-
values briefly, this is probably about $100 to $125 bottle,
Right.
and
He just found it in the.
found it in a
fence.
lot. It was for a milk bottle, which, to be honest, the milk bottle is probably worth half of this.
Yeah.
It's what I wanted, but this was in the mix. We didn't even notice it when we got it. And
Alex, on the Owens, Illinois symbol.
Yes.
What's the date on that? Is that from 29 to 54?
I think so. Yes.
Okay. So this would be anywhere between 1929 to 54, based primarily on the symbol back over here. You see the oval with the diamond.
And you told me the other one's 1880, you figured out.
The other one is 1880, and I'll tell you why. Because you can see that on the top that this was applied. You can see the
Yeah, I
glass
know.
slightly twisting over here, and so you have the side seam only going up to about here, and
Yeah,
then
okay.
the tool is used
Little
over
bit,
here. So
little
we're
bit,
talking about
yeah.
1880.
Yeah,
then.
with the core, with the core.
And this one, again, that one too. As I say, it came out of the same.
Yeah, this one looks more like a possible reproduction because the line goes all the way to the top.
Rub on.
And this is not really a slug plate. This was hard for me to tell. I
I've
couldn't-
seen those before. They're not terribly. They're not terribly new, but
Right, I think this is more real.
yeah. This is a machine made.
And there's-
What are they for exactly? They're for.
That's a
whiskey.
repro.
No, it's probably 20s or early 30s, I'd say. No, these are not. We haven't had any reproductions tonight. They're all original. They're just not rare. I've seen them around in passing, but no, that's original.
Oh, you have another one?
All at Sloan's Liniment.
Any tips on cleaning?
Cleaning is a complicated question. I'll tell you this: when I clean at home, I'm very basic. And you have to be careful with these because the technique I'm going to tell you does not work well. It goes for round bottles, such as even this. Because I'm a milk bottle person, even though these are mustard bottles. If I get real serious, I use some light soap and water with copper BBs and I shake it around. Or I'll use a bottle brush.
Yeah.
Can't use them on those because if you shake that around, the BBs will shoot out the side.
Just like, because this has a line from
Oh, that's
something.
solid.
Yeah, what I would recommend in a situation like that is at Home Depot or most of the box stores, you can get a product called CLR.
Right.
It's basically vinegar on steroids.
And so
And, you
that'll
know,
help.
let it soak, but when you put it in there, walk away for about three or 4 months.
That'll help if the bottle has calcification. I'll tell you this on a brief story. The professional, I don't want to say we're not professional collectors, but those that are very serious into cleaning will do something called bottle tumbling. And that's where a bottle like this is actually fixed into a PVC tube. It's fixed in place. And either on the inside or outside, usually they use a mix of a polishing compound. I've heard turtle wax. And the preference is cut copper wire. And it'll be housed in that PVC tube and rotated continuously for about 2 days.
Wow.
And that is the professional method. Now it's not flawless. You have to be careful the bottle is not over tumbled. At that point you'll start wearing down the embossing. And breaking the bottle is always possible. But that's the
The real serious
Expert.
collectors who do this, they have a whole series of different abrasives that they use.
It's a different model.
And if you over clean, what happens is that it develops kind of like a waxy, wavy finish, and it looks greasy. That's an unfortunate thing. You go to bottle shows, sometimes you see those. Knowing how to do it without going too far, that's where the art comes in, yes.
I've been collecting for a while. My basic is clocks and furniture. Leave it alone. That's my opinion.
that's what I do too.
Oh, no.
Yes.
It's very
I like the crust on it. I like the dirt on it. I mean, not to the point that it falls off. But
it's a very subjective hobby. Personally, I agree with you. All the milk bottles that I have at the Orange County Milk Bottle Museum at home, they're apart from some light soap and water, I don't really touch them. They're as found.
especially if you got paper on it, I just leave it alone.
Oh, and absolutely, you don't touch a beautiful old paper
Anyway,
label.
I'm
All
sorry, I
right.
don't like it.
No, well, thank you so much for coming by this
Thank you.
evening. Everybody, you've been a
Thank you
wonderful
so much.
audience. Thank you.
Yeah.